Good morning and welcome back to my channel. I have managed to write another short story based on random words, but before I get into that I just wanted to remind you that my second book of short stories, called The Museum of Forgotten Toys, is available on Amazon right now. You can get it in time for Christmas. It's a very nice, lovely book of 48 short stories, many of which have been published in literary magazines, and I think it's only 99 pence on ebook, or an astonishing something like £10.99, which I think is very reasonable, on paperback. So there you go, Museum of Forgotten Toys. This story won't be in there because obviously I've just written it, in fact yesterday. And this was based on a randomly selected story title taken from the hat, which I will bring out later. And this is story number 166, and it's called Beckoning. Mel hadn't worn the trail shoes for years, not since she broke up with Aunt, so she shouldn't have been surprised by what she found in the toe of the left one. It had evidently lain there, folded into quarters, for almost 3 years. She was tempted to use the word lurking. That cold, crisp, sunny December morning, Mel had made a last-minute decision to drive her new Fiat Uno into the peaks and go for a run. It would be her first for 7 months. Trail running was a habit Aunt had instilled in her, with some difficulty, since she tended towards the sedentary. The custom had dissolved along with their relationship after his infidelity. Scarred by the utter shock of Aunt's seduction of a 19-year-old student while on a 3-day college field trip, though he insisted it had been Surinder who seduced him, Mel had vowed to drop him like a stone into a deep well, and she had. Aunt had known that she'd had 2 cheating partners before. The first when she was a lovelorn teenager, the second her boyfriend prior to hooking up with him. Knowing this, he'd nevertheless completed the hat trick. She'd refused to forgive him, had broken up with him, and moved out of his flat within days, despite believing the entreaties he offered that his mistake had been an unrepeatable infraction. Aunt had looked shattered by her decision, and had stood weeping in the rain outside his flat, pleading with her as she packed bags and boxes into the back of her car, the seat folded down, depressing that her entire life at 35 could fit into the back of an Uno. An almost pathologically shy academic in classics, gangly with a sparse red beard that failed to masculinise his boyish features, Aunt had seemed one thing above all: safe. No teenage stunner would be getting hot and bothered thinking of Dr. Anthony Skellington at night, or so Mel assumed. Now, as she sat on the clothes-strewn bed, staring at the single felt-tipped word written on a piece of gold tissue paper, Mel resented having to cast her mind back to its significance. Beckoning. To most, that would appear a meaninglessly poetic word of no special significance. To Mel, it meant everything. It commemorated the occasion of their first meeting. She'd just joined the department, teaching English with a focus on the Romantics. He'd been installed and tenured for almost a decade, yet still managed to look out of place and awkward at departmental gatherings. They'd met at a poetry reading by guest lecturer Olivia Oluwade. Ever punctual, something she discovered she shared with Aunt, Melanie Forster had arrived at the time the event was scheduled to begin, 7 p.m. Unfortunately, the poet and organisers were still setting up the drinks and nibbles. Mel had chatted briefly with Olivia and her head of department, Professor McPherson, then picked up a volume of Oluwade's selected works and found herself a corner to hover in, sipping a glass of passable Pinot. Whereas Aunt was noticeably awkward in social environments, Mel had been told she tended to look busy and perfectly insular, never needing nor wanting company. In truth, she felt just as out of place as the tall ginger Welshman appeared. That said, midway through her glass of wine, with a full 15 minutes to go before the scheduled reading, Mel had exhausted herself trying to decode Oluwade's dense prose, whilst briefly acknowledging colleagues' nods of greeting. She needed a distraction. Aunt, or the stick insect, as she nicknamed him, not knowing his name, was hovering half in, half out of a conversation. He seemed to be trying and failing to insert himself into a group of colleagues who weren't inclined to widen their circle to invite him in. Did they hate him, or something? Or was he simply one of those people whom others instinctively ignore? It was awful to watch. Mel felt her heart begin to race, as if in sympathy with Aunt's. Surely he would bow out soon, nod, and excuse himself. Not that anyone would notice. He did nothing of the sort, merely glancing in her direction, a tight-lipped smile affixed to his angular face. Mel acted impetuously. She beckoned, literally turned one hand palm up, crooked a forefinger and called him to her, like some sort of siren. Remarkably, he beamed and trotted over, as obedient as a border collie called to heel. And that was their meet cute. It became a running joke. Siren-like, she beckoned, and like a wayward Odysseus, he untied himself from the mast and ran to accept his fate. Of course, her beckoning hadn't been at all calculated, and Mel began to regret it before Ant reached her. Still, once he'd got over his initial stammering, Ant proved to be charming, erudite, self-effacing, and wryly funny. Plus, oddly sexy, given his remarkable height, 6 feet and 5 inches, and impressive cheekbones. Mel had wild, unruly curls, described herself as curvy on internet dating sites, and hadn't seen her own cheekbones since she was 12. She stood barely 2 inches over 5 feet tall, and was a full decade Ant's junior. Yet 10 minutes into their conversation, Mel found herself imagining his angularity sinking into her softness. The notion made her neck flush. Their courtship had been cautious and stumbling, but they'd quickly become inseparable. Cohabiting in campus accommodation within 7 months, engaged within 2 years, Mel had never felt more loved or secure. And yet, a dark-eyed beauty had distracted and captivated her stick insect. A second-year student, barely more than a child. The memory disgusted Mel, and she forced the girl's face out of her mind the instant the memory began to coalesce. Mel hadn't found out, and probably wouldn't have had Ant not felt compelled to confess. He was the kind of man who felt the need to leave a note under the windscreen wiper of a parked car, having accidentally dinged the owner's wing mirror. Scrupulously honest. Technically, he hadn't lied to her at all. Ant had told her about his wrongdoing within an hour of returning from the trip to Athens. Shouldn't that count for something? He'd pleaded. Probably, she conceded, and yet it didn't. He'd broken the invisible compact she made with herself, never to feel this way again. Now, 35 months later, with Ant's image a fading flame, occasionally kindled by a Facebook-inflicted memory, here she was reliving that fateful evening. She'd beckoned, and ginger trauma had come running. Not merely trauma, though. That was the point of the Willy Wonka-esque golden ticket, with a single word handwritten upon it. It commemorated an act of inspired desperation. After they'd fought, 2 hours that simultaneously seemed like an eternity and an instant, Mel had stormed out, gone to meet a female friend in a local pub, to bitch and moan and drink and call Ant names, and begin the process of withdrawal. Ant had seemingly got creative in her absence, digging out a shoebox of craft materials from the spare room, and cutting golden tissue paper into hundreds of small squares. He'd then written things upon them and hidden most of them around the house, while liberally sprinkling others where she'd find them upon her return. A trail led from the front door up the stairs to their room. Each word or phrase encoded a memory. Hey on why. Their first trip together to the literary festival, where they'd shared a twin room, only pushing their beds together on the last night. Blossom pinch. Mel's weird habit of pinching Ant's bottom wherever she saw spring blossom. One in, one out. Ant's frugal policy for shoe ownership, inconceivable to Mel. Nurgles, Ant's nickname for the dimples at the base of Mel's back. Whitewater panic, the time Mel had persuaded Ant to try the extreme sport of whitewater rafting on the Tara River in Montenegro. Fur babies, Mel's inability to pass a small dog without crouching to pet it. Mudslide, the first trail run Ant had taken Mel on, where he'd skittered down a muddy slope, twisting her ankle. Ant had given her a piggyback back to the cottage. Remarkably, she'd run with him again 3 days later. Ring of power, Ant's one act of rebellion, a teenage nipple piercing he still had, which no colleagues except Mel knew about. Beckoning, the moment of curious kindness that had brought them together. She ought to tear it to pieces, burn it, flush it down the loo. Mel wondered how many more of these forlorn reminders she'd discover, perhaps years into a new relationship, hidden among her possessions. Ant really had gone to town. He'd concealed his oblique reminders behind paintings, inside vases, in the bolt holes of cellar doors, under rugs, within an electric toothbrush, inside the locket her grandmother had left her. Mel thought she'd found them all. Almost 300 of them at last count. Clearly, she hadn't. Years from now, Mel could imagine a young couple moving into the college digs Mel and Aunt had shared and long since vacated. A gay couple, perhaps. One of them would find the phrase "strategic disclaimer" written on a piece of tissue paper wrapped around the shaft of a light bulb. It would baffle him for days, and his partner would deny all knowledge of it. Neither would ever know that these words referred to the self-deprecating preamble that would accompany any gift from Aunt, no matter how small. It's not expensive. I just saw it and thought of you. It's probably daft. I'll still have the receipt if you want to return it. Mel decided that now wasn't the time to eradicate her last memory of Aunt's kindness and creativity. She ferreted beneath the bed in the spare room for the shoebox where she'd once kept rolls of tissue paper. It now held only flattened, folded, or crumpled reminders of what once had been and might be again. Not with Aunt, of course, but with someone. Fond memories. Mel tipped her new finding into the pile of leaf-like fragments, replaced the lid of the shoebox, and stashed it back where it belonged. I thank you. So that's my story, Beckoning. And now, let's get the magic hat and choose another title for the next story I'll write. So I can't even remember what the titles are that I wrote, because it was done about 4 months ago now, I think. Okay. I'll show it to you first. What does it say? It says, I was wrong. Okay. So the next story will be called I Was Wrong. So if you enjoy this, please subscribe to the channel if you're not a subscriber. Hit the like button. Hit the little bell that tells you about reminders. Tells you, sends you notifications that I've done a new story. And possibly share it with a friend or make a nice comment on social media, because let's be honest, I'm not changing the world with this channel, but I am giving you a lot of free creativity and maybe some inspiration, who knows. And again, on sale on Amazon. If you like the story, you'll definitely like some stuff in here. And I'll see you again very soon. Thanks for listening.